Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's workshop on localizing the Sustainable Development Goals, also known as the SDGs. My name is John Beal, and I'm the manager of SDSN Canada, which is a national network hosted at the University of Waterloo, working to mobilize Canada's universities and colleges for the SDGs. We're pleased to be one of the co-hosts of today's workshop, along with our partners, Green Beacon and the Tamarack Institute. And together we are three organizations looking to advance the SDGs in Canada, specifically through the lens of localization. We'd like to begin the workshop today by acknowledging that we are three organizations working together from headquartered in Waterloo, Ontario, but also working from across the country in Waterloo and in Montreal, Quebec. So in Waterloo, these lands are situated on the Haldimand Tract, which is land promised to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River, and is a traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. In Montreal, the lands are situated on the traditional territory of the Ganengahaga, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst many First Nations, including the Ganengahaga of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Huron-Wendat, Abenaki, and Anishinaabe. We also acknowledge with respect the diverse histories and cultures of all Indigenous peoples of this country. Acknowledging reminds us that our great standard of living is directly related to the resources and the friendship of Indigenous peoples. And we invite you each to reflect on where your feet are planted today and explore who shares that land base, its colonial history, and what transformative acts can be achieved over the coming decade towards reconciliation and justice. We encourage you in the chat or in your name on Zoom to let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you'd like also including your organization and affiliation, just to give everyone a bit of a sense of the diversity of participants today. So welcome everyone to today's workshop. Today is a chance to convene a growing community in Canada that's interested in localizing the Sustainable Development Goals. You know, in 2015, the world came together to adopt the SDGs as a vision to guide and accelerate global action on the urgent environmental, political, and economic challenges facing our planet. But for the SDGs to be a success, we need to find ways to convert these global goals into ambitious local action. So we talk about localization of the SDGs as a process with many pathways that reflects to reflect the SDGs and the priorities and concerns of our communities and local governments. So with that, I'd like to pass things over to another of today's workshop co-hosts, Laura Schnurr from the Tamarack Institute, to help set the context for today's meeting. So over to you, Laura.
Thanks, John. Hello, everyone. So I am the Director of Community Climate Transitions with Tamarack Institute. For those of you who haven't heard about this work, Community Climate Transitions is a new national network Tamarack recently launched that's supporting communities to advance a just and equitable climate transition and implement the SDGs. Tamarack as an organization is relatively new in this space, and we certainly appreciate all the work that's being done to date around localizing the SDGs in Canada, including the workshop that was held in October of last year, which this session builds upon. So today's conversation is taking place at a pivotal moment in society. We decided on the tagline from recovery to resilience because while we're still certainly working to ensure a just recovery from COVID, and in many ways we're still responding to COVID as we witness this fourth wave across the country, we're also finally able to catch our breath a bit and look at how might we design a more resilient and equitable future going forward. And this is where the SDGs really come in. They're by no means a perfect framework, but as John said, they do provide a common vision for everyone, everywhere, of a world that's free of hunger and poverty, with reduced inequality, affordable clean energy and climate solutions, good health, prosperity for all, and much more. Just before the pandemic began, we were at the eve of a new decade, and the 2020s were declared the decade of action for the SDGs. There were 10 years left to achieve the SDGs or global goals by 2030. And we've certainly had some setbacks in the last couple of years, but we've also made much progress. One of the things that brings me a lot of hope is actually Goal 17, partnerships for the SDGs. I've recently seen new partnerships and relationships emerge and other long-standing ones evolve in ways that bring me hope. Our big dream for today is that this conversation sparks many more partnerships for the goals. And we're pleased to share that SDSN Canada and Tamarack are partnering going forward to offer an open and accessible community of practice for those who are working on the SDGs in Canada, so that they can come together regularly and engage in peer learning. Anyway, more on that will be shared at the end of today's workshop. So that's a bit of context for our call today. And I just wanted to give you all a warm welcome and thank you for being here. So back to you, John.
Thank you, Laura. Let me just do that. So we have a wonderful agenda today. We'll start momentarily with our first session, which will help set the context of the SDGs in COVID and really kind of shine a light on why they're more important than ever as a way to build a new social contract for change in our communities. We'll then next feature a conversation on city implementation of the SDGs, and we'll have a conversation with representatives from the city of Los Angeles and the city of Bristol, who are two leading global champions for SDG localization. And then we'll follow this session up with a 30-minute networking opportunity to get to know others who are working in this localization space who have joined today, followed by a break. And then we'll resume back at 1 o'clock Eastern from the break for our final session on developing community partnerships for the SDGs, featuring fantastic speakers from across Canada sharing their experience on bringing the SDGs to community conversations and planning. We'll have another short networking breakout session and then some final closing thoughts, and everything should be wrapped up just before 2:30 Eastern. So we hope you're able to join for different sessions. The meeting is being recorded and will be available to all participants after the meeting, along with some of the kind of high level notes. And then we also have a Jamboard, and that'll be, the link to that will be posted in the chat in a quick second here. And the Jamboard, you can share your reflections, your aha moments, your experiences on any given topic from today's agenda. And our colleague Jorge Garza from the Tamarack Institute will be managing the Jamboard, and he'll work on collating all the information and kind of putting it together after the meeting to share that back as part of the session notes with all the participants. So take a look at the Jamboard, and if you have any kind of reflections or thoughts, I encourage you to use that to kind of put a little sticky note on the appropriate page, and that'll be compiled as part of the broader notes from the session. And we want to also acknowledge that though today's workshop is in English, we recognize that SDG localization work is happening across English and French Canada. And we'll be working hard to incorporate all of this work and lessons to be learned in this growing localization community that Laura was mentioning that we're convening and organizing. And then lastly, a couple of Zoom, pieces. We're all familiar with online meetings now, but as with all online meetings, there's some logistics that make everything flow a bit more smoothly. So if you can keep your microphone muted and raise your hand if you'd like to be called on to speak or ask a question, there'll be Q&A opportunities. So we encourage you to do that. And the chat function will be actively monitored. So, share your thoughts, comments, questions in the chat as well. And we'll try and pull some of those into the conversations as they're happening. So now it's my pleasure to pass the mic to another one of the co-hosts of today's workshop, SS Ahmed from Green Beacon, to start into our first conversation. So S, I will pass it over to you.
Great, thank you, John. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Please allow me to introduce Shaylin Wabe-Jijek, who is an Algonquin Anishinaabe youth. Her pronouns are she, her, and kwe, and she graduated from Trent University with a BAH in Indigenous Studies and Philosophy. Shaylin works for the Kawata World Issues Center as the Program and Outreach Coordinator And until March 2021, she was also a coordinator for the project called Advancing the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs 2030 agenda in Nogo Jivangong, Peterborough. She is currently the project lead on advancing gender equality, SDG 5, in Nogo Jivangong, Peterborough. She is also one of the 7 Ontario youth backed by EcoJustice, bringing the provincial government to court for weakening their climate targets, violating Ontarians' charter rights to life, liberty, and security. Welcome, and thank you for being here, Shaylin. It would be great if you could tell us a bit more about yourself.
Miigwech, thank you, S. It's so great to be here with everyone. So I'm going to introduce myself in my language, Anishinaabemowin. Anin bojo, Shaylin Wabigishik Gindishnikas, Nanote Wizawin Timiskaming Donjaba, Atikindodem, Minjikning Ndonjaba, Minwa Nogojiwanang Ndada. So I said, Anin, hello everyone. My name is Shaylin Wabigishik. My family is Algonquin from Timiskaming First Nation and we're Caribou Clan. I grew up in Rama First Nation on the Res and currently live in Peterborough, Ontario. So yeah, I work for the Fourth World Issues Center, which is a global education and resource center. And I'm really interested in how the SDGs can unite people with shared values and how the SDG framework and Indigenous knowledge systems can complement each other. So I will explain a bit more about our project and the Indigenous Leadership Action Team that led that project a bit more in the final session. I'll be on that panel. Thanks.
Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. You mentioned the Indigenous Leadership Action Team, and I'm wondering if you could share some of your thoughts and experiences around the SDGs principle of leaving no one behind.
Absolutely. So to me, SDG localization really means bridging the gap between this global theoretical framework and the tangible reality in communities. People in every community have to struggle based on factors that are most often out of their control. And we all have our positions on how far we've been left behind in this society. This society was not built to benefit everyone, but achieving the SDGs need to work for everyone. We need to take an equity and human rights-based approach with different approaches for different people in a way that is identified by them and works for them. For Indigenous peoples, we have survived attempted genocide and still face human rights violations due to these systems that were built to erase us from existence or assimilate us. It's really important to acknowledge our history, which is why Indigenous peoples continue to be furthest left behind. We need to build new relationships based on shared values and ask ourselves what that means on the ground. We need to learn how to work together to truly leave no one behind and foster equity and sustainability in our communities.
I think you raised some really good points about creating the spaces and centering the voices of those left behind and truly engaging in a participatory process. I'm wondering, based on your work and experiences with the SDGs, what are some concrete actions you would recommend to practitioners?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the SDGs provide a shared value system that can benefit everyone, and implementing them must fully involve those who are left behind. So the SDGs are an avenue to provide capacity to allow the solutions to emerge from within these communities. It means providing capacity to take a bottom-up approach to lift those who are currently oppressed and discriminated against. So my first recommendation is to meet people where they are and give them space to equitably share their voices in a way that's based on their rights. Accommodate folks to be able to participate meaningfully. For example, accessibility for those who require it, compensation equitably. And for Indigenous nations, we have different rights than settlers based on our treaties and inherent rights given to us by the Creator. When engaging Indigenous communities in this work, we need to be aware that Indigenous knowledge is the original sustainability on this land and can complement the SDG framework, which is why centering Indigenous leadership is so important. Local governments, institutions, and organizations alike need to engage with their communities because they already have most of the data and their priorities if you ask them. In order to gather this data and knowledge already within the community, we need to educate people about the SDG framework and how they can contribute to it. We did this through community forums on the SDGs. Ideally, this education would be rooted in the land, in natural law, and integrated with multiple knowledge systems in partnerships with Indigenous peoples. And finally, when dealing with any data about Indigenous populations or within Indigenous communities, we need to be aware of and follow the principles of free, prior, and informed consent, and ownership, control, access, and possession. And there will be a link to that after this session, this event. So this is the principles of how to connect with First Nations and how their data and information will be collected, protected, used, or shared. So those are my suggestions.
Thank you. So let's continue the conversation. So the point you make about integrating multiple knowledge systems is really important. What concrete steps would you recommend to initiate the process of relationship building with Indigenous communities where we live in a way that is respectful and reciprocal?
So I can only speak from my short little bit of experience, but for a more in-depth explanation on how to build and maintain relationships and partnerships with First Nations, our SDG project's Indigenous consultants created an Indigenous collaborative programming report that outlines more details on these steps, which I'm going to explain. So first, of course, is to educate yourself. Take time to learn about the Indigenous peoples, the treaties, and the history of the area. Research your responsibilities of being a good treaty partner from sources that are created by Indigenous peoples themselves. Then you can take your first gesture. So when you're ready, after you've educated yourself, reach out to someone from that community who's engaged and deals with outside relations. Introduce yourself, your reason for engaging with them, and your intentions in a truthful and respectful way. If you want to ask them to participate in something, you can give a gift that they can use in exchange for their time, their energy, because for the relationship to be healthy, it must be reciprocal, my bad. And after explaining what you want them to do, ask them what their protocols are and what they would like in exchange. Often it's tobacco, sema, or one of our sacred medicines. It should be known that this isn't usually something that should be bought because it is a sacred medicine. It should be only gifted or grown. You can have food, share a meal. That's a great way to build a relationship. And of course, honoraria, you can pay them equitably for their work. And it can be a combination of those things. But also something really important, and especially in the Americas, is when building relationships and engaging Indigenous communities, you have to be mindful of the differentiation between the band council members and the community members. So there are often dissenting opinions within communities and band council systems, which these systems were not built by us. And so there are different protocols for engaging different people as well. So elders are treated with the most highest respect, knowledge keepers and band council members and leaders, chiefs are dealt with differently. So it's important to engage with them based on who they are. And then finally, maintaining the relationship. It's important to initiate relationships that you plan on keeping. Like any relationship, you need to maintain it because it requires time and work to show you really care and build trust. And also, of course, ask what their protocols are on how to maintain a relationship.
Great, thank you so much for sharing that. So we have talked about the SDGs principle of leaving no one behind and the implications for Indigenous nations and Indigenous peoples in Canada. We have talked about relationship building between settlers and Indigenous peoples that is respectful and reciprocal. The next step is, how do we create the bridge where we integrate and intertwine the Indigenous knowledge systems and Indigenous ways of knowing respectfully to complement the SDGs framework to ensure we are working towards a just, inclusive, and sustainable community and society?
So as we know, the SDGs come from this Eurocentric Western worldview that does not reflect many communities and individuals' realities. So to achieve what we want to achieve, we need structures that allow us to come together, to communicate and construct a new way of doing things. To be just and inclusive, we need to make space for multiple worldviews and knowledge systems. We need to decolonize our spaces, processes, policies, and procedures so there is room for that. We need to decolonize our way of governing and integrating Indigenous knowledge systems. And to do this, we need to use a framework on how to bridge different worldviews. So Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers have already created frameworks on how to engage and integrate these worldviews together. Elder Albert Marshall, Mi'kmaq elder, created the two-eyed seeing approach. And so this refers to learning to see from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing, and from the other eye with the strengths of Western knowledges and ways of knowing, and learning to use both eyes together for the benefit of all. There will be a link to more in-depth explanation of that by Albert Marshall. And also there's another one called The Ethical Space of Engagement by Willie Ehrman, who is an Indigenous philosopher. And so the ethical space is formed when two societies with disparate worldviews are poised to engage each other. It's about diverse societies and the space in between them that contributes to the development of a framework for dialogue between communities. So for me personally, I am mixed. I grew up in this Western system, but I'm also Algonquin Anishinaabe. And I have to do that work within myself to reconcile my two, disparate worlds that I live in. We often call it walking in two worlds. And we are live bridges on how these two nations and worldviews can come together. I learned philosophy, Western philosophy, and Indigenous studies in my degree. And, I was always making bridges and really seeing how these two frameworks really complement each other. They don't have to be so opposing. So I want to share actually what I learned in my Indigenous environmental studies and sciences class at Trent University, taught by Dan Longboat. So there was really incredible diagrams. So I wrote them out on a piece of paper. So the first one looks like this. Hopefully you can see it. So generally, as we move through time, there are laws of the land, and the land has natural laws. And for a long time, humans lived within those and did not strive to change them. Indigenous peoples around the world created their laws, societies, and cultures with that land, cultivating complex societies over thousands of years, rooted in deep relationship with their relatives. The plants, animals, and nature. And because of colonization, the British created the Dominion of Canada and imposed the federal, provincial, and local government laws, disregarding the laws of the land and Indigenous nations. And every treaty we have made has been broken. And the spirit of the treaties were made for Indigenous peoples to have our laws and the settlers have theirs, but all these treaties were broken and our sovereignty was taken by force and violence. And now today, there are self-governance models in Canada and more are being negotiated. And it would be lovely if those laws were able to reconcile and humans can once again live in accordance with the laws of the land by integrating the wisdom of Indigenous peoples' laws. So another one of the graphs that he shared with us is this. It kind of looks like this. So this big fat arrow going forward resembles the capitalist system from our society, which our society is built on, and that really leads to destruction. So people try to change the system from the inside and also try to critique it for change, which has helped. And Indigenous governance and worldviews and sovereignty represent another arrow that's smaller, that has a lot of potential because it provides an alternative system that has been here for a lot longer, and can basically provide a much more attractive alternative and a more attractive outcome for humanity. So it provides people a choice to live in a good way. And this is Indigenous governance, Indigenous economics, political systems, and also too often, Indigenous peoples are only included in conversations about environment and science, but our societies can offer much more to political and governing structures of society too. That is actually where democracy came from, is from our clan systems. And this is the original sustainability, as I said before. So to restore our human rights, Canadians must understand and honor the treaties. These are the root causes of the injustices that we face today. And a good example of that, of one of the treaties here, is the Two-Row Wampum. So this was created by, I believe, the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations, and the Dutch, I believe. I hope I'm right about that. And so there's two purple lines that are going through time, and there's three white lines in between, and the white lines resemble the river of life flowing, and the two purple lines in the middle resemble the Indigenous ways of living, and the other one is the ship that resembles the colonial governments. And we were supposed to be never interfering with one another. That's why they're parallel. We're supposed to live like in harmony with each other. But of course that didn't happen. And so, that is kind of the spirit of the treaties that we need to get back to, is to restore our ways of being, our systems, our languages, our culture. This is called for by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And there's lots more happening, talking about the land back movement, where Indigenous peoples are able to govern on their own land. So this means sovereignty and outside of oppression and leaving no one behind. So I'll pass it back to you, S.
Thank you so much, Shaylin, for joining us today and sharing your invaluable knowledge and experiences. And almost everything you've talked about can turn into an entire conversation on its own, right? And so I feel that there are a lot of opportunities for future conversations here. As we come to the end, it would be great if you could share your final thoughts and a call of action for us.
Yes, thank you. So my final thought, especially around leaving no one behind, is that to remember that we can't leave our relatives behind. The land and the waters and all of nature, we have to remember that those are our relations, and they are part of us and we are part of them, and what we do to them, we do to ourselves. And we need to be able to give this land back to the future generations that we borrow this land from. So my call to action would be to, read the reports and resources that I'm going to share if you're interested. Also, do your best to build or strengthen upon the relationships that you have with Indigenous peoples, whether that's in your work or in your personal life, and build those relationships and focus on shared values and start these conversations within your own life, in your own work and everything you do, because, the future depends on it. Good. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Shaylin. And S, very such an important part of the conversation that we're having around the SDGs and kind of what we're aiming for, and how do we include the world. And in Canada, there's such a diversity of peoples. How do we make sure that this is an inclusive agenda for change? And so thank you very much for that conversation, setting it up. I know there's different comments in the chat and on the Jamboard, so I encourage everyone, if they have some thoughts they'd like to share, to post that on the Jamboard and check that out. So I'd like to invite now for our next session, Angela Kim and Alan McLeod to turn their videos on, and I will make sure I put a spotlight on you so everybody can see you. And we'll move now to our session on city implementation of the SDGs. And I think there's so many different dimensions of how do we localize these goals, and this I think is such a crucial one around kind of city leadership. Just as a brief setting the context, cities are a focus of SDG 11 on sustainable cities and communities. But many of the SDGs have a direct impact on residents and businesses and community organizations. So we see the SDGs kind of as a whole as having a lot of relevance and impact in our communities. And as a result, we've seen a lot of increasing attention from city leaders using the SDGs as a common language to connect different city and community efforts around a set of shared goals and indicators. And especially in the midst of the COVID recovery, and I mean, we're not necessarily out of COVID yet, but thinking about the recovery of what the world and our communities are doing coming out of COVID. Many city leaders are looking to the SDGs to help mainstream some of the ideas and principles of equity and sustainability into the decision making that they're making, and laying foundations for how do we build back better or build forward better coming out of COVID. And there's a tool that many cities are using called a voluntary local review. It's a process, a tool, a report that cities are using as to kind of land their commitments to the SDGs in. And we'll hear more about that from Alan and Angela shortly. But these voluntary local reviews, VLR, they're inspired by the process that countries around the world use to report their progress on the SDGs to the United Nations. But with the difference, VLRs are exploring how current city actions and priorities contribute to the SDGs, looking at for gaps in planning, opportunities, and partnerships that might be created. VLRs offer a really useful storytelling tool to help city leaders connect a local strategy, a community strategy to a broader global agenda, and also the opportunity to integrate the SDGs into city planning. And I really want to explore that with Angela and Alan as well, about how do we make local sustainability efforts more comprehensive and coordinated and aligned with the community around the principles of transparency and inclusion and engagement. I will mention also that we have SDSN Canada has created some VLR briefs, short briefs summarizing the experience in Los Angeles, Bristol, and Pittsburgh. And I'll post the link in the chat shortly. And if anyone is interested in learning about kind of some of that process as a reference point in some of those cities, about how to create a VLR, how to bring the community together, I think it's a great resource to share. So we'll make sure to share that out in various forms, but I'll post that in the chat shortly. And then just quickly before we jump into the session now, there is a lot of city work happening on the SDGs throughout Canada. The city of Kelowna in BC was the first community to formally create a voluntary local review, and they did that in close partnership with the BC Council for International Cooperation. I know that the city of Quebec City, has done some amazing work, not in a VLR form, but in integrating the principles of the SDGs with their community planning and strategy going forward. I know the city of Winnipeg is working on it. I know researchers at Lakehead University and are partnering with folks at the city of Thunder Bay. Peterborough has, city of Peterborough and with Kawartha World Issues Center, as Shailene was talking to a little bit, has been doing work in this way. So there is great work happening across Canada, and part of our hope here today is to bring some of that work together and to continue to have those conversations so we can all learn from each other. So with that, we will hear from two wonderful speakers in this session. I'm pleased to introduce Angela Kim, who is the SDG Program and Data Manager with the City of Los Angeles, and Alan McLeod, who's the Operations and Stakeholder Engagement Manager and SDG Coordinator with the Bristol City Office in the City of Bristol in the UK. If you are interested in speaker bios, learn a little bit more about Angela and Alan's background, you can see that on the Tamarack event page for this event, where they've listed speaker bios for everyone. So with that, over to you, Angela and Alan. I want to start the conversation just hearing a little bit about kind of the story of the SDGs in your community. You know, what was the context and kind of why was it the focus on the SDGs? Maybe Angela, I can throw it to you to start us off.
Thanks, John. First of all, thanks, John and us, for having us here today. I'm so glad I got the ending of the last session. I learned a lot in the 10 minutes that I got to listen in. And I actually went to graduate school in Toronto, so Canada has a special place in my heart. But to answer your question, in late 2017, I think we were in a much different reality than we are today. There was a vacuum in national level leadership in the US on the SDGs. So the Conrad and Hilton Foundation, which is based in the LA area, approached the city with an idea of what it would be like for a city government to work and engage on the global goals. And so the work in Los Angeles started as a pilot. And back in 2017, 2018, the idea of cities working in this global agenda was pretty novel. Today, I think there's hundreds of cities that are committed to doing a VLR or doing some sort of mapping exercise or have SDG related projects. But in 2017, 2018, there was a handful of cities doing that work. And it also really helped that we have a Mayor Eric Garcetti of Los Angeles, who has strong leadership and commitment in solving global challenges with local action. So it made for an easy partnership between the city and the foundation, and that's what kickstarted our work here in LA.
And how about you, Alan, in the Bristol case? Tell us a bit about the context, kind of what catalyzed this work.
Yeah, thanks, John, and thank you for, again, similar echo Angela's thanks for inviting me and Bristol to be part of this day today. The context for Bristol was that actually in 2015, just around the same time as the SDGs were being developed, Bristol was the European Green Capital at that time. And as we finished our year as European Green Capital, a number of people within the city started to look at the SDGs and think about what it might mean to use this international agenda at a local level. And so towards the start of 2016, a network called the SDG Alliance in Bristol started to form and meet semi-regularly on an informal basis to discuss what that could look like. Off the back of this, the network managed to get some support from the University of Bristol, who was a member of the network, to use some of the student resource within the city to think about whether or not the SDGs were a useful framework for a city like Bristol. And from there, the work began to grow, and there was interest from the mayor, who'd already heard about the SDGs and some of the forums that he'd engaged in at the international level. And so there was a mixture of a sort of bottom-up grassroots approach with a network of individuals and organizations from it was a cross-sector network, the SDG Alliance. So it's got public sector, private sector, academia, and all sorts in there, as well as communities. So that network, combined with the interest from the mayor and the interest from the council, sort of convened in the middle, and that's where the work grew from, I guess.
That's great. And I might, I might jump around a little bit because I think you both mentioned something I think that's really key to the process in each of your cities is you had really strong support from the mayor. And just kind of curious, like, to hear from you about, how do you think you can foster that in the kind of leadership in your city? There's going to be having that vision set from the top. I think is such a crucial element in bringing this agenda in. And was it more the exposure you think that they had in kind of the international forums and thinking about how does that align with my sustainability thinking? Do you have any thoughts kind of on what that looked like and maybe, pieces that people can learn from in that process? I'll just leave it open, but if anybody, either of you wants to jump in.
Do you want to go first, Angela?
I just had a thought as John was phrasing the question, is that now that there's hundreds of cities doing this work, there's more of a motivation for other mayors to join this, this movement of cities engaging on the VLR. I think that SDGs really allow cities to join the conversation in the global space, to talk about how cities can deliver on the goals. So everything, all 17 SDGs are related to basic city operations. It's not just SDG 11. So there's a lot that cities can offer. But besides that, I think mapping to the SDGs, aligning to the SDGs, making a public commitment to the SDGs also allows cities to have the seat at the table at these international conversations, and saying, how can cities be more engaged? How can LA connect with Bristol so that we can move the work forward for both our cities and learn from each other in the process? I think there is more of a motivation now than there was a few years ago. But beyond that, I think it's about showing the value add of the SDGs to your local community, and not selling this idea of a global agenda and being part of the global citizenry. I think there's a lot the SDGs can offer on the ground to the communities that we're serving as local government.
Yeah, I would completely agree with what Angela said. And I think that's one of the key things that we had to communicate at first within the local government, was that this isn't an extra framework that they need to report on. It's not an extra set of rules or legislations that they need to be meeting. It's largely speaking a lot of what they're already doing. It's about how you can improve the integration of that work across the city, and try and make sure that you're better connected both within a city government, but also within the structures of the city and the organizations within the city. I think on top of that, from the perspective of our mayor, Mayor Marvin Rees is the first directly elected Black mayor in Europe, and I think he sees there's a role for him in advocating the voice of those who've been less heard in society. And in a previous role, I was working at the University of Bristol on the SDGs as a cross position, working between the council and the university. And we interviewed Mayor Marvin Rees on his interest in the SDGs. And one of the things that he said was that actually it helped Bristol to demonstrate how it was committed to its communities, that it's diaspora communities. So there's a number of communities from around the world that live in Bristol, and actually delivering on the Sustainable Development Goals is both for people in Bristol, but also for their families around the world. And I think for him, that was a really powerful message, that actually it's not just us delivering on the issue of climate change in Bristol. It's about how that issue affects the poorest and the most marginalized around the world. And so I think that's another element. And I think the final element that we found was that it actually meant we could bring different sides of the political spectrum around the table to discuss the urgency of various issues. So in Bristol, for example, we've got quite a strong environmental side of our political arm, but we also have quite a strong labour and sort of social side of what we're doing. And so bringing together both the issues around poverty and the environment, the issues around justice and inequality, was really powerful through the tool of the Sustainable Development Goals. And being able to connect those issues up was something that the mayor found very useful, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that both of those experiences, I think, can really speak to how, I know there are some on the call that are working on the idea of localizing city staff. They're working in their community organization, working with the city on different files, and the idea of socializing the city to the SDGs. And so I think that there's, a wide range of experiences, and it's exciting to see it grow. Like you were saying, the momentum has certainly kind of taken off since 2015. So thank you for that. I want to just maybe give you each a minute, if you can, or just kind of the high level of the approach you use in the VLR, and maybe some of the elements. I know that the city of LA has a really clear and fantastic methodology that's shared through the website. And Alan, you mentioned different elements with the SDG Alliance in the community, and then the city commitments. And so just kind of, if you wouldn't mind just sharing a little bit more broadly about the approach, and then also maybe if you could think about how that has that approach changed, or will it change because of COVID? What has the impact of COVID been kind of on your city's approach to this? maybe Angela, you've started, maybe you can go again, and we'll switch up the order for the last half of the session.
Sure, happy to. So in LA, we were working with a team of students to align the city strategies and plans to the SDGs in 2018. It was about 18 students that were working on this with us. And the intent was to share these findings, which we did in our first VLR in 2019. When we started to look at the SDGs, we wanted to look at them holistically across sectors in Los Angeles. And the 4-phased approach that you mentioned, John, was going through mapping and alignment, gap analysis, localization, and mobilization. So that was the 4-phase approach that we developed for the 2019, our first voluntary local review. I wasn't actually in the city for this time. I joined right after the first VLR was published, but I think Erin Bramajan might be in the audience and led that effort here in the city. And so when we first started, we really wanted to take this cross-sector approach, looking at private sector, nonprofit, academia, and other government initiatives and how they align to the goals. And we thought that it made sense to look at it goal by goal and try to understand each of these sectors and how each of these sectors was approaching the agenda. And it was an exercise that really helped us see where the city's direct responsibilities start and stop with respect to each goal. LA, as with many other local governments, have really complex jurisdictions on who oversees what part of the development agenda, not just in thematic areas, but also in geography. If you look at the map of LA, it's a very wonky piece of land that we draw out. It kind of looks like a state. But then this process also helped us identify other stakeholders and where the responsibilities and actions of these stakeholders fall into the goals. So that was the approach in 2019. And I think the mapping and alignment is where a lot of cities start. Where we're trying to move, and we've been trying to move and add more resources into, is that now that we understand the mapping and alignment and a little bit of the gap assessment, how can we move into action? How can we use this information to create new projects, new partnerships, bring added capacity to the city, work with our other city colleagues on specific projects that are being driven within the city, but add the SDGs as a new lens? How can the SDGs framework help us move forward these projects? And COVID, it's such a big question. COVID has really shown not only the disparities, the systematic inequalities that are present in local governments and any government and system, to be frank, but it has also shown the immense power and capacity that local governments have to deliver action. Cities became the primary delivery venues for vaccination and testing and social services in Los Angeles, from direct cash assistance to childcare, to food services, to the elderly populations that couldn't leave their homes. So cities really activated during COVID. And we're using the same lens to show that cities can be activated to solve all of these other challenges. COVID has also shown the intricacy connections between planet, prosperity, and people, and that also translates to the goals. So I think it's shown how important it is for cities to be activated, for cities to be connected to each other. During COVID, there was this huge WhatsApp group where cities were just talking to each other, asking, how is your city rolling out vaccination? How is your city starting to deal with opening schools? So we had this direct contact at the staff level. So it's shown the importance of that connection as well. And we're continuing to bring all of that learning into the SDGs. During COVID, we didn't take a step back from the goals. We actually leaned more into it. And last summer, 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic, we hosted, I think, 54 students virtually to help us solve city problems related to the goals. So we designed 9 different projects. I can talk more about that later on, but I think COVID just, unearthed a lot of inequalities, but it also showed the capacity that cities have to think, build partnerships, think cross-sectionally, and connect to this other cities around the world as well.
Thanks, Angela. Yeah, Alan, over to you if you have any thoughts you'd like to share on that.
Yeah, so I think the context of Bristol is an interesting one, particularly for the VLR, but just more broadly speaking in the COVID context as well, because alongside the work on the Sustainable Development Goals as a city, we've been trying to change the way that we operate in terms of our governance over the last 4 or 5 years. So when our mayor, Marvin Rees, came into office, one of the things he wanted to try and do was align the organizations and the strategies within the city so that they were more connected and actually more efficient in that way, so that actually organizations and communities weren't pulling in different directions. And as a city, we were more planned across the whole system for a longer term. And that is in essence, the team I work for, the city office, is trying to do that. We work to a long-term vision of 2050, and we're working to try and coalesce organizations around this long-term plan that we have, the One City Plan. And that is the backdrop for the work on the SDGs as well, and the work on the VLR, because what we wanted to do within our VLR was recognize the citywide delivery of the SDGs and the way that the whole city was playing a part in that. And that's through the SDG Alliance that I've mentioned already, but also through this work within the city office. And so the VLR that we conducted had quite a large amount of engagement with organizations outside of the local government, a lot of case studies reflecting the activities of over 90 different organizations within the city. And that was something that we undertook and wanted to try and reflect in our VLR, because we recognized that actually it wasn't just going to be us as a local authority. And in the UK, we've got a really highly centralized system of local government where the central government controls a lot of the levers. And so in that sense, we need to work as partners if we're going to deliver on any of these goals. And that's what we wanted to reflect in our VLR. And then I think that VLR and a sort of having that report as a tool to demonstrate to people what it means to deliver on the SDGs has been really powerful in the last couple of years, to basically say, this is what the SDGs are, this is how delivering the SDGs looks. And so actually we've had a lot of buy-in since the VLR from a wide range of organizations, and increasingly more and more within the city are engaging with this. And in the aftermath of doing the VLR, the SDG Alliance has more than doubled in its size. So it was about 70 or 80 organizations. It's now over 180. And alongside that, the city office has seen similar growth in terms of the engagement across the city. And I think the issue of COVID and the challenge of COVID, like Angela said, was actually that it brought together people in partnership in a way that we wouldn't have seen otherwise. But I think one of the things we found and we reflected when we spoke to our director of public health in the city in Bristol, she said that actually if we didn't have this one city approach that we have in Bristol, this way of working, we'd have had to create it. We'd have had to create that partnership approach and that effort to try and work across all these sectors. And so for us, the SDGs were a key part in that, in terms of engaging with more organizations. But the whole One City effort and the whole Bristol City office was key in our response to COVID and our response to the pandemic. And as a result of that, we've produced a citywide strategy for recovery, working and consulting organizations across the city from community level all the way up to the big strategic businesses and chambers of commerce. And within that, the SDGs formed a key framework for how we wanted to do that and for the way that we wanted to recover. And so I think in our mind, similarly, we've pushed further into the work on the SDGs. I'm not sure if it's quite as a result of COVID, but during the COVID pandemic, we've gone further in that sense. And we've been learning off of the city of Los Angeles in their data portal. And we currently have a graduate intern working with us to add data onto a similar portal to what Los Angeles have. And we're also developing another set of case studies from organizations in the city who weren't previously engaged. And we're working with another set of students to do that too, to try and find some of those best practice examples that could be replicated elsewhere within the city and rolled out across communities. So I think that's the sort of VLR from our end, and also the COVID pandemic and how that's affected it.
Yeah, thank you. And you mentioned the One City plan, and it's a question I wanted to come back to, but maybe I'll just bring it forward. And this is a plan to 2050, as you mentioned, which is, frankly remarkable. I think you kind of were able to break out of the political cycle, which often, shorter term planning, and really think about long term, what the city wants. just wondering if you have any thoughts on kind of, to share with others that are maybe advocating for that, but, are not finding the reception that they're looking for, or needing to kind of make the case. It seems to fit very well with the SDGs, even though they're a, to 2030 framework, but and kind of within that, there was a question in the Jamboard that came around, aligning systems of measurement between the SDGs and locally determined priorities. You talked about how the One City Plan is really helping to bring, it's not just a city plan, it's a community plan. So if there's anything there you could touch on as well, I think that would be really instructive.
Yeah, so I mean, I mentioned that the One City Plan grew out of that network of stakeholders in the city, and the original group of those stakeholders was, some community organizations, but also large businesses, and I think we've shifted and we're growing more in our work with communities. And actually what we ended up doing to start the One City Plan and start some of that visioning was working with community development workers and listening to the issues of communities and the ambitions of communities to sort of set out a timeline and where do we want to be by 2050. Because so many, as you say, so many of the strategies and structures within cities, and in particular in Bristol, were set on a short time frame of 2 to 5 years. And it was about thinking in that longer term and saying, if we think in a longer term, what are the challenges or ambitions we have for this city that we can start to unpick now? And it's a recognition that actually the big systemic challenges that we face, like racial inequality, like gender inequality, or climate change, or poverty and multi-generational poverty, they're not going to be solved in 1 or 2 years, and they're not going to be solved by 1 or 2 partners. We really need to actually work with organizations across the city, on the ground, at the strategic level, to actually change how that works. And that's embedded in the nature of how we try to do everything within the city office. And so for us, the long-term planning helps us to think about how we can tackle the huge systemic issues. But I think it's also a really key opportunity for us to set out what we want to be as a city, and to say to partners, this is where we want to head. Are you on board with this? Are you actually in it for the city? And that helps us bring on board organizations and individuals and demonstrate that actually this is the direction that the collective city has aligned around. Are you on board with that? Can you help support the delivery of that? And as you mentioned, the SDGs are a key milestone within that. And there are, they're sort of, for us, the 2030 way marker, where we get to test whether we're heading in the right direction. And that's similarly to that question on metrics. That's something that we've spent a lot of time thinking about. And we actually had a micro grant from SDSN back in 2018 to delve into some of these questions around data and a data framework. And that became our data framework for the Voluntary Local Review. But what we did was a twofold exercise. On the one hand, we reviewed the SDGs through a paper that the Urban Institute had produced, which was called Hacking the SDGs. And so we reviewed the targets in that way to look at which targets were relevant. But we also took what was in the One City Plan and we mapped that against the SDGs to see which targets were relevant from the communities of the city and from the people of the city that are operating. And there was, broadly speaking, almost direct alignment. There were 1 or 2 where the community of Bristol was more ambitious than maybe we thought they might be when you looked at the targets in terms of a pure relevancy basis. But actually that then was used to form our data framework in terms of the targets that we wanted to report on and the targets that we wanted to have indicators for. And so from there, we're now working to think in, and I won't steal Angela's thunder, but the work of Los Angeles has gone a bit further than that. And they've pushed beyond to think about how all the targets could be relevant. And we're sort of starting to do that same work now. But that is where the data work has grown from, is actually in looking at what the community is interested in and also comparing that against what the relevancy of those targets are.
Thank you. Yeah, Angela, I don't know if you want to jump in on that question, or just kind of a little bit on the data approach that Alan was mentioning, but feel free, or let me know what I have another question I'd like to ask. But
no, sure, John. Just a couple things that as Alan was talking, I was thinking about. So LA has a long-term plan in sustainability as well, which is called the Green New Deal. It has specific targets, the 5 zeros. I think it's zero emissions, zero waste, zero wasted water, a zero carbon grid. I always forget the 5th one, but I'll put it in the chat. And that some of the targets take us to 2045, 2035, 2045, depending on the target, and includes some of the social economic indicators that we have planned for the city as well. But in terms of the data, in LA, we have really put a lot of effort and resources into making our data reporting robust and transparent. So we're reporting on SDG indicators in an open source and transparent way so that residents in the community, the world at large, can see how LA is faring on our progress. You can find that at sdgdata.lamayor.org. So through that process, we've been able to identify local data sources and how LA is being captured in data systems at the state, federal level. There's some, I don't think there's international ones, but local data sources as well. And through all of these, we're trying to add a local perspective to it, disaggregating where that data is available so that we can see geography, but also social characteristics of where and who people may be left behind. And now we're trying to move a step forward beyond just the reporting of the data to adding some lived experience stories into our reporting. So it's not just about metrics at this 10,000 foot level, but also how are these metrics being lived out by people, residents in LA. And that's the stories that we're adding in our second voluntary local review, VLR, that will be published next month in September. So watch out for that.
Thank you. I'll just remind everyone in the audience as well, great time to submit questions through the chat, Jamboard, or if you would like to come on screen to just raise your hand and we can give you permission. And I will keep going and I'll try and weave them in as they come in. So, collaboration, clearly essential. You both talked about the process and how engaging with the community and input, not just to create this 10,000 foot reporting structure for the city, but to actually link it to community priorities, So I think this is, and we'll talk about this a little bit in the afternoon session around creating community partnerships, but curious from the city perspective, how can you create the structure for this collaboration on the SDGs? Are there certain things for, city representatives on the call today that they can be, thinking through about ways to engage community organizations in this process? And then also on the other side, for community organizations working in this space, wanting to engage the city, do you think there's approaches or kind of effective means by which they can kind of start that conversation and kind of start diving into it together? Maybe Alan, we could start with you if that's okay.
Yeah, so I mean, I think for us, the way that we convened community partners was in the first instance through the SDG Alliance. And so we were able to bring a wide range of different communities into that network to hear about their challenges and to raise them to significance and to a wider audience as a result of being part of that alliance. And the alliance and the targets within the SDGs provide specific focuses and projects to convene around and to focus around. But I think that is similar to what we tried to do with the One City Plan. And one of the real ambitions for that was always to try and have tangible, concrete opportunities for engagement and for action. And we normally take this approach of doing an offer and an ask of what can you offer to the city and what are you asking back from the city? So, for example, in the past, we had a program around foster care where the council had about 100 odd kids that they needed to get into foster care. They needed to find homes for the children. We worked with the local newspaper, with a local firm, a local investment firm that had changed its employment practices to be more foster friendly, and basically shared that employment practice with other city partners, with community groups and with businesses to say, could you consider becoming a more foster friendly employer? And as a result of that campaign through the newspaper, and as a result of the changes in employment practices in the city, we're able to reduce the number of children who needed foster parents by a third. So we're able to pretty dramatically reduce the challenge in the city by working with partners and by convening around one issue. And we've done that similarly with other issues around homelessness and around period poverty. And actually, by bringing together community groups and businesses and others around a single issue, we're able to drive that issue further forward and take action. And what we also have alongside those specific issues is a sort of governance structure that helps us bring in different voices into the conversation. And so we have in our One City plan 6 different themed areas. So we've got children and young people, environment, economy, homes, health, and transport. And alongside that, we have a board that represents each one of those themes. But what we also have is a series of advisory forums in the city. So we have an older people's forum, a climate advisory committee, we have a committee on race equality, we have a women's commission, disability commission, a culture board, digital board, all sorts that feed into those themes and help support with both the delivery and the expertise of the challenges in the city. And so we're able to draw the community voices through those advisory forums into the sort of actors and the doers that sit on those thematic boards and then take action on what's in the One City plan. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah.
I've got a great diagram for it all, but yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Angela, over to you.
I think our experience in LA is pretty similar in that we have structures within city government that allow for the voices of the community to make it into City Hall through neighborhood councils that are 99 neighborhood councils throughout the city of Los Angeles, as well as various boards and commissions, similar to what Alan mentioned. But one advice I would say is that because so many efforts align to the SDGs, it's important to use a project to start work on the goals instead of using the goals to start a project. So what we've done with our city partners and internal stakeholders and creating projects where then we match with a student team at an academic institution is to focus around a specific project that they need to work on. Instead of going to the Department of Transportation and saying, how can we solve the SDGs together? Instead, we'll go there and say, SDG 11.6 is specifically about access to public transportation. How can we create a project together around access to public transportation that can utilize the framework of the goals and then find students to do that? Or on the other hand, we've also had academic experts who come to us and say, I'm really interested in doing a project around gender equity. How can students support this work? And we then find city colleagues within, we'll find our colleagues within the city who work in that issue area to craft a project together. So it's always about the project and how the SDG framework can support that project instead of starting from the SDGs and then trying to create a project out of that is much harder because you're so complex and abstract unless you have a specific problem at hand. It becomes a challenge to create something concrete.
Thank you. Yeah, and actually, we were actually quickly running out of time, but I wanted to just touch on one point briefly there about the academic partnerships, because that was a very important element for both of your experiences, both cities' experiences. We run a network that's primarily universities, colleges, mobilizing around the SDGs. And so thinking about the role of academia in partnering with cities or helping cities to advance this work. I don't know if you were talking about a bit about it, Angela, there. Alan, do you have any thoughts you might want to add on, or Angela, anything else you wanted to add? So I think it seems like a critical element as well of kind of how this process was happening.
Yeah, from the Bristol perspective, we started with that relevancy assessment by students, by master's students, but the funding for the position of an SDG Research and Engagement Associate, which was my former role, was from the university, and the idea was to straddle the university and the city council and to basically provide university expertise into how can you localize these goals, how can you use this global agenda. And that expertise was helpful, particularly when the council didn't have the resource itself to think about how to do that, but also when it didn't have the links or the connections to elsewhere in the world and to others who were doing that. And so we were able to use the academic weight of the university to support the city council in that sense. But it's something we've continued to do on a number of projects in a similar way to Los Angeles. And it's something we're continuing to do going forward, both in terms of funded internships for students, and also a number of the courses at both of the universities that we have in Bristol require a work-based learning opportunity, or require taking a learning role in a workplace. And so we've been using some of that as opportunities for students to learn more about the goals and to become enabled and empowered in taking action, but also as opportunities for us to get extra resource as a city council. If I'm being fully open about that, it provides extra resource of skilled and highly educated young people with a drive and ambition in those areas. And so I think universities are really key in that sense, but there's also a real key component of what they do as anchor institutions as well. They are large employers in many cities and have a large turnover, both in terms of the spend they have and their procurement, but also in terms of their employee base and how they pay people. And so there's a big opportunity for universities to think about their SDG footprint, not just through the buildings or through the students that they teach or the opportunities that they provide in that sense, but also through the way that they behave as an institute. And that's something that the universities in Bristol have really thought about, and they've mapped their courses and their activities against the SDGs, as well as their corporate strategies. And that ties into some of the work that's now going on at a lower level with schools, and lower as in further down the education system, but at secondary schools and colleges in Bristol as well. We're now working with them to think about how their curriculum contributes to the delivery of the SDGs, and how they're talking to their students, and how their students can have opportunities to be part of both learning for that future economy, but also driving action and change now.
Thank you. Angela, if you have any comments.
Just a quick add, John. We've spoken to a lot of cities and academic institutions throughout the US and globally. And I think when it works, there's commitment from both sides. And of course, cities can get a lot from this partnership. We get additional capacity, we get the faculty expertise, we get the student excitement and energy to move this work forward. But I think the academic institutions get a lot out of it too. The students get to work on hands-on projects, on actual local challenges, instead of learning theoretically about it. And we always hope that by bringing them into the city government, they learn more about how their city government functions, and they can become more engaged residents of the city. So I think there's a lot of win-win situations focused around projects. So it's not just to the benefit of the city or just to the benefit of the academic institution.
Thank you. Thanks. I think we have come to the end of the session. I know there's a few other questions that I was interested to explore, but I think we've done a really good job of exploring the big scene, and then diving in on some of the key issues and approaches that each of your cities use. So I really want to thank you both so much for coming and sharing this experience with this Canadian and international audience. More to come, I'm sure, as we develop this community. We'd love to keep you involved and engaged in different ways. Also to Aaron, who's on the call from the LA team as well. I see you there, and it's really exciting to kind of see the work that each of your communities has been doing, and to help see how that inspires others around the world. So hopefully there's some inspiration from this conversation today.
So let's get started here. So the focus of our first panel was on city implementation of the SDGs, and we explored the crucial role that cities play in local governments in advancing the goals. Now we're going to turn our attention to community engagement and partnerships for the goals. And we have three fantastic speakers with us today from the community sector. So I'll first introduce the speakers, and then we'll get going shortly after that. So we have Tasha Leckman, Vice President of Philanthropy and Community with the Foundation of Greater Montreal, also based here in Montreal. That's where I'm based. I think I forgot to mention that at the beginning. We have Shaylin Wabegijij, who you know already from the beginning. She joined us at the start in conversation with us. She is an Algonquin Anishinaabe Youth and Program and Outreach Coordinator for the Kawartha World Issues Center, for those of you just joining now. And we have Amy Cullis, former lead policy researcher on Kelowna's Voluntary Local Review. She was working with BC Council for International Cooperation on that. And as was mentioned earlier in today's session, Kelowna's VLR was the first voluntary local review in Canada. So we're really excited to have her on the line to talk about that. So I'm not going to read their bios. They all have amazing bios, experience and expertise. Jorge has put the link in the chat box, so please do take a look if you'd like to read more about their backgrounds. So as I said at the very start of the workshop, when we opened today, the progress we've made on Goal 17, Partnerships for the SDGs, is what brings me the most hope. There's been a profound recognition over the past few years that the scale of the problems we face today demands partnerships across sectors and among unusual suspects. The complexity of these issues requires us to engage with the community, and especially those living out the challenges, in a much more profound way than in the past. We really need to co-create solutions together. I'll share a short story. When I joined Tamarack in the spring, the first thing I decided to do, I think within the first week, was to develop a new major guide on localizing the Sustainable Development Goals. The idea was to follow a sort of signature Tamarack format of the 10 guide, which includes 10 questions for assessing self-readiness, 10 ideas, 10 stories, 10 resources, and 10 ways to get started. So I got started on this right away. First step was bringing together an advisory group of SDG leaders from across the country to generate the content and provide the overall guidance. And many of those members are on the call today, and Shaylin is among them. The process of developing the guide, it turned out to be an incredible way to learn about the amazing leadership that Canadian cities and communities are showing on the SDGs. I heard inspiring stories and ideas from coast to coast to coast, and I was able to reconnect with past partners and also forge new relationships in the process. So I'm pleased to share that this guide is now complete in both English and French, and we're soft launching it today with you at this workshop. So I will put the links in the chat here for you all to visit that later, but we're really proud of that work. I'm also happy to share that all 3 panelists with us today in this session represent 3 of the 10 stories in the guide. So Tasha collaborated on the story about Montreal, Shaylin on Peterborough, and Amy on the Kelowna, and also Kusum, who was another member of the committee. So welcome to you 3. Looking forward to this conversation. I'd like to start with a kickoff question that's really around, just sort of in a general sense, describe to us your work on the SDGs. We've heard a bit from you, Shaylin, already about the SDG project in Peterborough and the Indigenous Leadership Action Group, but we'd love to hear a bit more. If you could go in a little more depth about how that process worked, how you formed that governance group, and so on, that would be much appreciated. So I'll start with you, and then I'll move to Amy and Tasha.
Hey, thank you, Laura. It's so great to be here with you today. I'm coming to you from Mississauga Anishinaabe territory that's covered under Treaty 20 and the Williams Treaties. And I'm so thankful to this land and waters for giving me life every day. So yeah, here in this territory, we developed the Sustainable Development Goals project through our Global Education and Resource Center, also known as QUIC. And we worked with local partners such as Trent University in 2019, where we had an initial community forum on engaging people on the SDGs and what they are, and identifying our community's top 5 priorities. And one of them was Indigenous leadership. which we thought originally was going to be SDG 17 partnerships until we realized that it didn't really fit. So that's why we created the Indigenous Leadership Action Team. And that guided the work of our year-long project from March 2020 to 2021. Right as the pandemic got started, we were getting started in this project, and that came with many challenges, but also opportunities. So the Indigenous Leadership Action Team was comprised of local Indigenous folks, and that team led the other priority action teams, which were based around the other 4 SDGs, no poverty, quality education, clean water and sanitation, and climate action. And so that team met first, and all these teams identified work that's already happening in the community and mapping that, and really our priorities and how we can come together to further these priorities. And we had Indigenous consultants and an elder advisor on the project to make sure that we were centering Indigenous leadership in all of our work. So that was one of our main principles, along with the principle of leaving no one behind. So I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. I'm going to turn to you, Tasha. So you've been active on the SDGs. We've been working on them together in different ways over the past few years. And I think your work dates back to around 2017-ish. So it's been quite a few years. Could you give us a bit of an overview just on what you have been up to at FGM and how you've integrated the SDGs into your work?
Great. Well, thanks, Laura, so much. And thanks to Tamarack for inviting me to be here today. I'm hailing from Montreal, traditional Mohawk unceded territory, and thrilled to be here. The SDGs for us have been, as Laura said, sort of an organic process. As a community foundation, those of you who may know community foundations know about our vital signs reports, and many community foundations across the country issue vital signs reports. And in 2017, we were celebrating 150 years of Montreal. And in that, 375 years of Montreal. And the leadership of the foundation at that time decided that our vital signs should be looking at the future and therefore looking at children specifically, which was new for us as a specific area. And at that time, the United Nations was also issuing their Innocenti report, which was aligned with the SDGs. So as we were working on our vital signs report, it became very clear that if we really wanted to position our local action in a global movement, that we could align with the UN report that came out just before our vital signs report, and therefore align with the SDGs and the way we were reporting on our data around children in the future. And so that was sort of the first aha moment where we said, wow, we can really position ourselves in this way. And then out of that came a concrete project, which we called our Zero Hunger Project. And what the vital signs revealed was that Montreal is the city that has the greatest, the worst, and not greatest, the worst really, food insecurity in Canada. We're the city with the highest levels of food insecurity. And so there were other kind of appalling things that came out of the vital signs, but that was the one that felt the most powerful and the most actionable. And I think it was said in one of the workshops this morning that creating concrete projects is really an important way to mobilize people around the SDGs. So there was a decision to focus on one SDG, which was zero hunger. And in the context of a community foundation, those are always tricky decisions to make, and probably in other foundations or organizations as well, to kind of hone in on one issue or one SDG, obviously is at the detriment of the others, although we know that there's a lot of interconnection. So there's always that tension there that we're playing with. So what we did, and I'll just wrap up quickly, and then we can get into it in more detail, but is we convened a number of different types of players. So the Department of Public Health, representatives from the city, representatives from our local United Way, Centraide, other foundations, as well as grassroots organizations on the ground providing services, food banks and food counters, to really come together and work with the objective and try and understand and paint a picture. So it was really data collection and information collection of hunger in Montreal to then try and promote concerted action. And so that was sort of the beginning of our journey. And then we can talk about it in lots of different ways, because then the questions around data, who holds the data, how we share the data, how we report on the data become very live issues.
Thank you. Amy, moving over to you. You've been the lead when you were with BCCIC on developing civil society relationships and partnerships and other partnerships as well around the Voluntary Local Review that Kelowna produced. Could you tell us a bit more about that work and your role in that?
Yes, thank you, Laura, and thank you, Tamarack, as well, for inviting me here today. I am joining from Vancouver, the unceded traditional and ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish nations. So yes, as Laura mentioned, I worked as the lead policy researcher on Canada's first voluntary local review for the city of Kelowna, which was published in April of this year. It was a third-party review with the BC Council for International Cooperation, working in partnership with the Global Empowerment Coalition of the Central Okanagan, GECO, and in collaboration with the City of Kelowna, more specifically in close consultation with the Department of Policy and Planning. So the aim of this project was to better understand how the City of Kelowna has aligned local efforts with the global 2030 agenda, and with the goal being to review Kelowna's progress towards achieving the 17 SDGs outlined in the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So just to really quickly go over, the VLR involved intensive research and consultation, identifying targets and indicators localized to Kelowna's geographical and socio-cultural context that were within the city's priorities and abilities to affect change. And we worked with CSOs, researchers, academia, and Indigenous organizations to identify the gaps and obtain the qualitative and quantitative data to conduct the review and outline the trends, challenges, and progress being made on all 17 sustainable development goals. So a lot of work. And we really sought to make sure that the recommendations were actionable, and also to highlight the successful and replicable programs and initiatives that were making positive change in Kelowna. So my role had many different elements to it. Some of those elements were helping to determine local targets and indicators through the review and analysis of many different municipal planning documents, national level reports, existing district, provincial, and national objectives and indicators, as well as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report and the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls final report. And as Laura mentioned, a large part of my role was working with and building relationships with Indigenous organizations to incorporate Indigenous perspectives into the report and really obtain also qualitative data to contribute to a deeper analysis and really capture what's happening in Kelowna with regard to progress on the SDGs. So I worked across a number of goals on the topics such as homelessness, hunger, health and well-being, the criminal justice system, and the opioid crisis. And we worked closely with the Kelowna Friendship Society, which is the local urban Indigenous organization. Also worked with the FNHA, the First Nations Health Authority, which is a provincial level organization, among other Indigenous organizations. So it wasn't a straightforward or simple process. So I'm very happy to be here today to share insights and learnings on developing community partnerships, and to hear from Shaylin and Tasha and discuss their insights and learnings as well.
Thanks, Amy. Well, I'll follow up with a couple of questions then. given that you mentioned there were some learnings and some things that went well and didn't. So yeah, could you share some of those kind of key learnings around developing those relationships and collaborating during the VLR process?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think probably the main learning really was listening and really listening to answers. So I think it's sometimes we come from an angle of wanting to make others' stories fit into the story that we want to tell, and often we don't really realize we're doing this. But I think when you have, what we learn is when you have genuine curiosity and you're approaching the topic with from a position of care and respect, and you're ready to listen to what others are saying, and do your best not to put things into your own words and your way of seeing things, that's when you build real relationships and get real collaboration. I mean, it can make the process a lot longer, and it does mean that there is a lot more back and forth with a lot of double checking to make sure, oh, is what I said, is that really what you wanted to say? But it's definitely worth it. So that was probably the most important thing. But another key learning was really working to research and understand the work of the organization that you want to collaborate with is doing, why they're doing the work they're doing, how it might connect to the SDGs before you actually approach them. I realized that seemed to be a good way to start a relationship, because if you start only with if you're only coming from the framework of the SDGs, it can be a little bit alienating to someone who's not necessarily aware of the SDGs or has heard about them, and can't really fit in their work into the SDG framework. So it's good if you do that for them to some degree, to start the conversation at least as well. Perhaps another key learning would be that sometimes you can overcomplicate matters. So even if you're coming from a place of good intentions, so in one of the goals specifically, I remember that you think you're doing some good by connecting potentially what might be a local issue to a larger national issue, but actually you can end up making something more complex and actually misrepresenting the issue. So really building trust with an organization really helps to allow you to ask those questions. Is this really what's going on? And also allowing them to say, no, you've got it wrong. That's not what's going on. This is a different issue, and it's not really related to that broader national issue. So I think those are the key things.
Those are some great learnings. Yeah, thanks for sharing. There's a few things in there I'd like to come back to, perhaps once we've gone through and chatted with the other panelists here, but some really great insights. Just one more question for you, Amy. I'm curious. You spoke a bit about sort of what went well, and I imagine some of these learnings, they come from a place of, well, you maybe didn't do it perfectly, and you learned lessons around how you might do it differently. But yeah, if you could speak to what you felt went super well in your process, and what you might adjust next time if you were doing it again, that would be great.
Yeah, so I think for me personally, it's easier to talk about what went wrong than what went well. But I will say that I think what we did well was we did develop good working relationships with many CSOs and Indigenous organizations whose insights were really invaluable to the production of our VLR, and that really captured the nuances of what's really going on. And this is something that we are very proud of, especially considering the resource constraints that we faced. I think in terms of what we would do differently, there are a few things that I would like to mention. One of them is perhaps, don't assume that the information about who you are and what you're doing gets passed down to the whole team. So we reached out to an organization and were initially in communication with one person who connected us very kindly with other people in other departments. And we didn't manage to go into the same depth about the project that we were working on with each person. And so doing it in that way generated some distrust in the beginning, because these departments did talk to each other and were kind of like, who's, have you heard of this project? We're not really sure exactly what it is. And so we ended up having a meeting with those different departments and explaining our project in depth eventually, but I would highly recommend making sure you do that first before going to the different departments separately, because it just generates more trust and openness if you do it first. The other thing that I'd like to mention here about doing things differently is that obviously as a third partner review, we didn't have any official partnerships with any other organization, which can have its strengths, but it also can have its weaknesses. So during the process of our VLR, we learned that access to and collection of data on Indigenous peoples must be carried out in collaboration with Indigenous-led organizations and may also require approval from the local First Nations government. And so I think future VLRs need to make strategic decisions well in advance about which Indigenous groups they are going to partner with, which isn't a straightforward process, and obviously various factors need to be taken into account, but that's why I say it really needs to be done well in advance of getting the VLR underway.
Thanks, that's great. Really appreciate you sharing that, Amy, and we'll come back to you with a couple more questions later on. But at this moment, I'd like to move to Tasha. I really appreciated in your opening remarks, Tasha, how you shared the way that you galvanized action around food security, specifically in Montreal. And that's actually the focus of the story in the 10 guide I mentioned on Montreal. So people can read more about that there. The other thing you mentioned is the work you've done around vital signs and vital conversations, something that community foundations across the country are doing. I wanted to ask you a question specifically around how you've engaged community partners on the SDGs through that work. And also another question about specifically some of the Indigenous groups and organizations who are active on issues surrounding the SDGs, given that you and I are both based here in the traditional unceded territory of Kanen'kehá:ka Mohawk people, and there are a number of organizations who are really active on this. How did you go about those kinds of partnerships and relationships?
We're learning at the Foundation of Greater Montreal how to do that better. And I would say that in the 2017 Vital Signs report, we did it probably not at all. And in our 2020 report, we did it perhaps somewhat better, but we're really working on building our Indigenous relationships. The way we've done our vital signs reports in the past is really one massive document that comes out every 2 to 3 years. that an external researcher does for us with our guidance around what key issues are. And then that external researcher mostly looks at StatsCan data, like macro data that's publicly available, and sort of repackages it. And then we have what we call our strategic committee, which has different partners around the table who look at this first sort of data set around an SDG, around an issue, and ask sort of, does this make sense? Does this tell a story that could lead to a call to action? And I must admit that we've done a very poor job of engaging Indigenous voices around those tables. And we're working right now in a very concerted way to build those relationships in advance of the next round. And as Amy was saying around VLR, and Vital Signs is not a VLR, but those relationships have to be built in advance, because if you say, okay, we're doing, we're looking at our data on gender equality, SDG 5, I think it is, and we realize that we need to have a voice around missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Let's reach out to an organization and ask them to come to this meeting. Well, really, they don't, understandably and with reason, allocate resources and find a person to come and show up to that meeting, because we're really coming out of left field. So it can't be done at the last minute. So we're working on building those relationships. It's actually something I think I had like 10 different phone calls last week with different organizations, and trying to build those not only for our vital signs, but for our granting and for all the different things that we're doing as an organization. So a lot of learning and a lot of work to do there.
Absolutely. And I know at FGM, you have so many grantees who are working in various areas related to the SDGs. And yeah, how have you kind of gone about speaking with them around on the SDGs? And I wonder too about this sort of question that we've spoken about before around, like, is alignment enough? If people are aligned with the SDGs but don't go deeper, is that good enough, or do we really need more?
Yeah, that's a question that goes back, Laura, as you know, to the first time I met you in 2017, where we were at a retreat talking about the SDGs. And I have this very strong memory. We were in a beautiful setting and we were standing outside in a circle, and we were all just saying the things that came into our mind. And that was the question that I think a few different people said, is alignment enough? And I always hear it in that kind of soft outdoor voice. And it resonates for me a lot, because as you said, we work in our granting around a very wide set of issue areas. And sometimes it feels like we're imposing, and I think Amy spoke to this as well, to imposing the SDGs. We say, we're working around this SDG and these targets, and, make your funding application. And it's not language that necessarily speaks to the grantees, and to impose a framework that's different than the one that they're working with isn't particularly useful. And then when we're reporting in our annual reports, if we haven't done that, or if they haven't focused on a specific SDG in an explicit way, then how do we report around how we're moving forward different SDGs, at least in terms of the dollars invested in areas? So there's a tension there. Again, as a funder, we're really conscious of our position of power. And we're really trying to shift the way we're doing granting to work towards what's called, for those of you who might be funders, trust-based philanthropy. So to really be building relationships in much deeper ways with grantees, and creating longer term grants, bigger grant amounts. We've been a traditional funder where we give small amounts, $15,000 one-off for a project, next. So we're rethinking that model. And I think that as we build deeper relationships with grantees, understand what they're doing better, build longer relationships with them, then some of those questions around reporting and is alignment enough will at least for the granting side become much clearer, because it won't just be like slapping an SDG onto a grant. It will be something that's much more holistic in terms of the work we're doing. I will just say too that we're working on our strat planning right now, and we've thought a lot in our new mission, actually our new vision statement that has not yet become public. It will become public probably in end of September, October. We make direct reference to advancing the SDGs with our partners. And then as we go through it in our different priority areas, it becomes very complicated to say, well, there's 17 SDGs, and if we try and do all of them, then we'll be spread so thin that we won't make any impact. So we've thought that it's as you all know, and I've said this already once, everything's interconnected, but the way the SDGs are set up, they can appear to be a little bit siloed. And then if you go into the 5 Ps, people, planet, prosperity, of course, I always forget 2, and they're always different, the ones I forget, but then they become so interconnected that it's hard to think of how to report or how to focus around the 5 Ps. So we've actually just decided to create our own 3 axes, which are equity, inclusion, diversity, environmental, like transition écologique. So I don't know how to say that in English right now. And environmental issues, and the third one is around social inclusion. So where we're recognizing that there's all these SDGs that overlap, and now we're having discussions again around, well, how do we talk to our grantees about that? How do we report on that to continue to be part of this global movement? So I know that every question you've asked me, I'm like, well, we're thinking about it. We're trying to figure it out. But I think that it is an ongoing process. And every time we feel a little bit like we've landed on something, the complexity just increases, and we realize that we can continue to do better.
Yeah, thanks, Tasha. And thanks for the honesty. Someone in the chat box also said, thanks for your honesty there when you were speaking about the need to do better and partnering with Indigenous organizations in particular. And I think there's a general feeling in the room right now that we don't want to just hear people like, this is why we didn't invite politicians here, right? Just is like, give us the speaking points, like we're doing great work, blah, blah, blah. Like we invited you to share honestly, like what has worked, what hasn't, what would you do differently? And I just think that's really refreshing, and that's what's actually useful for people in the room. So I just wanted to thank you for that. And I think this is a really good segue to move to you, Shaylin, because the work you're doing is with Indigenous, centering Indigenous leadership and voices is exemplary, really, in Canada in terms of what I've seen. And I've been following this the space for a few years now. It's an exemplary, not just in the SDG space, but really in a much more broad sense. And I think it has implications for those working on just a number of issue areas in different sectors. So the Indigenous Leadership Action Team that you've described to us, that sort of Indigenous governance that sort of led and was able to drive the entire SDG project that you were working on, was really a fantastic approach to ensuring that Indigenous knowledge and leadership was truly guiding the work, rather than merely engaging Indigenous communities in a process that's led outside of those communities. And I wonder, you yourself are Indigenous, and you were able to really lead on that work and bring your own expertise and experience to that, which is invaluable. I'm curious, a couple questions for you. Like, do you think this model could be successfully replicated elsewhere? To what extent might it need adaptation? And then also a related question, if others are interested in setting up something similar for their own projects, an Indigenous leadership action team to guide the work overall, how might they go about doing that, especially if they're not Indigenous and they may not have strong existing relationships with Indigenous communities?
Great questions. Really grateful to be able to speak to that. For your first question, do you think that it could be reproduced? I think absolutely, and it really should. Our approach with the Indigenous Leadership Action Team was really successful in not leaving their communities and our treaty responsibilities behind. So replicating this model really would require a place-based approach, and it would need to be adapted based on where you are, what treaties are there, what nations you need to engage as rights holders. They're above stakeholders because this is their rights on their own land. So you might be impacting their rights, and you also have to think about what capacity in the community is available to support that. Because oftentimes our communities are really impacted by all these issues that were mentioned, like mismurdered Indigenous women and girls and peoples, and clean water, for example. So capacity is oftentimes an issue. So it's really important to build capacity and provide space to support Indigenous nations to engage and ensure that their communities and people benefit as well from this process. So yeah, I think people need to start where they're at in learning and educating themselves and building relationships to work in partnership with local Indigenous nations and learn how to be good treaty partners in that. And we didn't do it perfectly. Of course, it was in COVID. Well, the Kawartha World Issues Center has a really long history in this place and already has really good relationships with the local Indigenous communities. They're very active around here. We're super grateful to them for all the time and energy that they gave to us. So I guess to your second question, if you're interested in setting this up, how can you do so? So I think it's never too early or too late to begin building these relationships with First Nations and community members, like in urban areas. So a good practice is firstly to educate yourself and keep learning to build on your knowledge, to be a better ally, partner, a friend. So there are many ways to engage with Indigenous nations. So you can engage with the friendship centers that are off reserve, community centers on reserve, urban Indigenous organizations, band councils, and local knowledge holders. So it's important to note that, engaging band councils is an important step, but that is also a colonial structure. So you also have to engage the community so that those knowledge keepers aren't left behind. Their voices can often be different from the leaders, the chiefs themselves. So also to speak to Tasha's point about it being difficult to engage with these organizations because they don't have time built in to provide to other organizations. So our model was workshop conversations, like focus groups, where these we can get participants from those organizations and ask them, is there anyone locally that can be available and be as accommodating as possible to that? And they serve the Indigenous demographic within their communities, so there might be Indigenous folks there who have the time to do that. So just to finish off, it's really important to approach them with respect and transparency, humility. If you don't know things, it's okay not to know, but as long as you come from a good place, and do your best to learn and constantly improve and try to do better. And also asking Indigenous peoples what their protocols and processes are, so that they can engage meaningfully and be ready to adjust accordingly. I know it can be difficult with our timelines and funding, but I think it's really important to be able to adjust as much as possible so that we can have these real, genuine relationships. So oftentimes, it's really good to invite people to share a meal, outside of COVID, eventually one day. That's a really great way to build relationships. And also these relationships involve maintenance. So stay connected and updating each other on these processes. Yeah, just like really relationships, like friendships. So also just finally wrapping up, our Indigenous Collaborative Programming Report will be available. So that was created by our Indigenous consultants and elder advisor that outlines this process using our local context in Peterborough as the example. So you can also access that report on our website.
Thanks for sharing. And yeah, you raised some great points there around COVID and the context in which you're working, because you launched this, the 1-year project around the SDGs in March of last year. Am I right? It was just at the same time as COVID. And so what a challenge, right? To develop those relationships and do it in a good way during a pandemic. And that's something I wanted to ask you about, Amy, as well, because similarly, the timing of your VLR in Kelowna was really coincided with the pandemic as well. And you published your VLR in, was it April of this year? Yeah, and so we're working on it obviously through the pandemic, and here you are trying to develop relationships with civil society organizations and Indigenous groups and others. And I'd be curious to hear what lessons you learned around building and deepening relationships remotely, and are there any best practices or things to avoid?
Yeah, thank you, Laura. It's a really good question. I think some things that are top of my mind here are perhaps valid for non-COVID times as well, but especially during COVID. I think one of the main things that I learned pretty early on is don't only rely on one form of communication, or especially email. Really find out what is the preferred communication method of the person that you're working with. Some people just prefer a quick phone call or even a text message, is what I realized. Another key thing that I realized was that to really understand their job. Are they on the move a lot? Do they not in the office, not able to answer the office phone? Is there do they have a mobile phone that they prefer to be contacted on? And also just to be, related to that, as well as, be sensitive to where they're at with their job. So, for instance, I remember there was one person in particular who had a huge influx of work during COVID, and they were actually short-staffed for a large period of time. So it was, being more flexible with your own deadlines, and really working with other people to meet in the middle with things there. And I mean, again, like, as I say, this is regardless of COVID, but it does need mentioning, I think, is just to show genuine appreciation for their, their input and insights. I mean, which, are invaluable. You wouldn't be able, we wouldn't have been able to produce our VLR without the people that collaborated with us, and just making sure that they know that, and it's nice to hear, I think, and important to hear. So those are my main things I learned there.
Thanks, it's really useful. I think we're all still figuring out how to navigate this new world, and we need all the insights we can get on that. There's a couple of questions. Thank you to those who submitted questions for our panelists. Amy, there were a couple for you here. One was, what percentage of people approach were familiar with the SDGs? Well, let's start with that one, and then we can do the other one.
Yeah, great question. I mean, I'm not sure the percentage, but I remember a lot of people saying they didn't know what the SDGs were. I think almost the majority, I would say.
Interesting, yeah. And the other question from an audience member is, did you have representation from the private sector in terms of the relationships you built?
The private sector, I wasn't involved in that, if that was something. I think it was largely civil society organizations rather than the private sector. Yeah.
Okay. Good. Another question, and this could be for any of you. It relates to the question we just spoke about around how many people were familiar, and the majority were not. I think the SDGs remains quite niche. I remember a few years ago, I saw a stat around 11% of Canadians were aware of the SDGs. I don't know how much that has moved. I remember that was a couple of years ago. But I'm just curious if any of you have thoughts on, when we speak with different partners, do we always need to use SDG language, or is it more effective to discuss the SDGs in other ways, like using other frameworks and models? And a couple of you have actually alluded to this already. But yeah, just if we could get some thoughts on whether it's possible, even desirable, to speak about the SDGs without even using that language explicitly. Shaylin.
Sure. Well, to answer that, I do both. We do both at Quick. So especially when engaging Indigenous communities who think outside these frameworks, have their own frameworks, I find it beneficial to take time, to educate them on the work that we're doing on the SDGs, and also connect it to them by helping everyone understand how their local actions, what they're doing, the work they're doing, can contribute to the goals globally. So that kind of creates a global citizenship kind of unity. So, but they also have to speak about it within their own context. So when we're asking them to tell us about the work that they're doing, we don't ascribe them to do it on SDG terms. We kind of do that work after the fact. Like Amy was saying, I believe. So yeah, many organizations are doing this work and already have this data on a local level, but just don't use that language or even know about the SDGs. So teaching them that they can not only contribute to it, but benefit from it as well when they align themselves with this framework is a really great way to engage people who are unfamiliar with the SDG framework, like importance of clean water and sanitation in Indigenous communities. They can build capacity through the SDG network to help support that and kickstart that.
Yeah, I love that approach, because I think if we ignore the language altogether, we're not going to budge those numbers around people's awareness of the goals. But we also have to meet people where they're at, which is something that's come up again and again on this panel. So super, super important. Tasha, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I guess I'd just like to add that I think I agree with everything that's been said. And I would add, though, that I think, well, from our perspective, we have an education mandate of helping educate people around the SDGs, but also that if we can name common objectives that are in SDG language or in other language that resonates more, that then we can really be working towards these common goals in ways that are less siloed and that feel really productive. Because what we hear from our different community stakeholders is, especially in the context of COVID, they feel extremely isolated in the way that they have to pivot to deliver services in new ways, to meet needs of their clienteles, and that if we are identifying kind of in an explicit way common objectives, and then providing a way of collaborating and sharing information and sharing models, then there really is, and Shaylin, you spoke to this too, this sense of working towards a common purpose that I think is really motivating. And as you said, Laura, allows us to collect data where we're comparing apples and apples as opposed to apples and oranges.
Yeah, super. Great. I think that's actually, yeah.
I just wanted to speak also to the question around the public sector and private sector.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to actually ask because Sylvie, who had posed the question, mentioned it was a question for all the panelists, whether the noting that the private sector can be underrepresented.
Yeah, we really struggled with that with our Zero Hunger project, and it was an explicit objective for us to include all different types of stakeholders. And I mentioned some of them in my opening remarks, and I didn't mention the private sector. We did have some private sector. We had McKinsey, who we had partnered with for some reason, and they helped us kind of crunch some numbers and do some work. But when we really reached out to like major grocery store chains and foundations that are associated with some of those big grocery stores that are also investing in trying to solve the issue of hunger, what we found was that their teams that are thinking about these social issues are so lean that they did not have resources or prioritize allocating resources to participate in a monthly conversation or and so on. That said, and speaking to building relationships, and I loved what you said, I think Amy, about, or maybe Shaylin, about maintaining relationships like friendships and that you have to continue to invest in them. Those relationships that we built at the time and starting in 2017 with private sector actors, while they didn't participate fully in the process, the relationships became developed. So during COVID, they reached out to us and said, okay, we have this money that we want to invest in food security. We don't know where to put it, but you guys might, and we've come to trust you. So how can you help us pick where to invest this money and which organizations need it the most? And so I think I think like all relationships that they need to be invested in, and that bringing different stakeholders around the table to work towards these goals is important. And when we're speaking of SDGs, the private sector is very aware of them in a very different way than grassroots organizations.
Absolutely. I'm really glad that came up. It's absolutely crucial. I think they have a crucial role. If we are working on these issues within the community sector and public sector alone, there's only so much we can do, right? We really need to move the private sector. And well, I know you, Tasha, from my in my previous life in the philanthropic world as well, and that was something that was really key for us there too. So those multi-sector partnerships and collaborations we need to continue to develop. So that concludes our second panel. Thank you to the panelists and all the participants for being with us.
So it brings us to the end of our workshop today. I want to just say a few quick words before passing it over to Jorge and Laura as well, just to express our thanks to all of our panelists, all of you for participating and joining today and sharing your expertise and experience. It's clear that we're just scratching the surface with some of this SDG localization work. There's great momentum that's been building across Canada and continues to build. And we're very pleased to play a role to try and connect the dots and bring some of those resources to bear and learnings that we can help spread this great work across the country. And so with that, Laura mentioned it earlier, Tamarack Institute and SDSN Canada partnering to create a community of practice on SDG localization. So we want to showcase and highlight great work happening across the country, but also bring other resources and learnings from across the world for Canadian communities and organizations to learn from. So I will pass to Jorge, who will just kind of talk briefly about what this community is going to look like. He'll share a link as well, he just did actually, where you can actually sign up if you'd like to be a part of this community, and we will share the link with all participants post event as well, so don't worry if you miss it here. And we'll be convening regular conversations. So maybe over to you, Jorge, to tell us a little bit more about what that looks like.
Sure, thanks, John. We're delighted for you to be here. And as John said, I just shared with you the link to our community of practice. It's on SDG localization. This is going to be a group of peers committed to sharing and learning about how to localize the sustainable development goals in our communities. Our upcoming session will take place on September 28th from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern time. if you go through the link, you can find out more about the benefits of the membership. This is an open group. Our commitment or guiding principles, some resources that will be populating over the next couple of days, and more information on the organizations that are hosting this conversation, SDSN Canada and Tamarack. And yeah, so we would be more than happy for you to join us for these sessions. It's going to be on the last Tuesday of every month. Laura, is there anything else that you'd like to add?
Thanks, Jorge. Yeah, just to say that we really want this community of practice to be by and for the community itself. So we hope that you'll take ownership of it and feel like this is your community, and also help shape it. So in our follow-up email that we'll be sending to participants later this week, we'll include a link to a very brief survey to get your feedback and input on that. We are specifically interested in what themes you'd like to explore. We have brainstormed quite a few internally, for example, developing a VLR, voluntary local review, or community SDG action plan, community engagement, localizing targets and indicators, Indigenous reconciliation, impact measurement, et cetera. A lot of the themes that came up today. And we're also keen to get input on what you'd like out of it, as we can work on developing the format as well. We're looking to experiment with different formats, presentations and peer learning, private webinars with outside experts, peer input process, etc. So stay tuned for that. We will also be sharing out the Jamboard with links and resources that were mentioned in the chat box today as well. We'll integrate those into the Jamboard. We'll be sharing out the recording from today's session, and again, that link to the community of practice later this week. And apart from that, I did just want to mention one event that's taking place next week that's related to this same subject of SDG localization. It's also the official launch of the 10 guide on localizing the SDGs that I mentioned and shared with you. And I'm just gonna share the link for that one in the chat box. It's taking place on the Wednesday, the 1st, from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern. So it's just a 1-hour event. And we have some fantastic speakers, including a couple of people who are here today and not in speaking roles. So, I'll just close by thanking you once again on behalf of Tamarack, SDSN, and Green Beacon for being here today. And we look forward to seeing you at future events. Take care, everyone.